Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for inviting me. It's really fun to talk about this research, especially with people who have worked on the site. And just by looking at the people that I saw at the beginning of the meeting, it looks like several of you that are attending were actually part of the excavations at Mission San Lorenzo. So this will be an update, I hope, for some of you, and for the rest of you, it's probably new information. But what I wanted to focus on tonight was the things we've been learning from the excavations at San Lorenzo and its relationship with San Saba, and in particular, the impact of the events that unfolded at Mission San Saba and how they impacted San Lorenzo and other parts of the Spanish colonial world. So what I thought I would do is start by just providing a brief overview of the history to put everything in context, talk about the founding of both of these sites. And I have to start with San Saba. So the mission of San Saba and the associated site of Presidio San Saba were both established in 1757. In this map, you see the yellow area. That is actually the area of Spanish Texas, so a lot smaller than the state of Texas today, but nevertheless, that was Spanish Texas. You'll notice a little red circle area there. That is the location of Presidio San Saba. The mission was a separate site, and it was located about 4 miles to the east. Both of these sites were located on the San Saba River. The site, you'll notice, is outside that area. Both sites were outside the area of Spanish Texas and kind of existed in this no man's land between Spanish Texas and New Mexico. So the mission in Texas, for those of you who don't know, in Spanish Texas, missions and presidios went together. So wherever you would have missions, you would have a presidio. And usually you'd have one presidio and maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 or more missions established together. And the purpose was to have the religious and the military side come together to help hold the Spanish frontier and to also convert the indigenous populations. So Mission San Saba and Presidio San Saba there was a lot of motivation behind their establishment. And just like other missions and presidios, the goals for this particular venture were to missionize, in this case, the Lipan Apache, and also to help protect and expand the Spanish frontier. So the Lipan Apache, for many, many years, were a thorn in the side of the Spanish. They were conducting raids in San Antonio and were a menace to the Spanish. And so the hope was that maybe they could settle them down in missions. If they could do that, then in theory, they could convert them to Christianity and turn them into quote unquote civilized citizens that would be loyal to the crown and help hold this area of Texas for Spain. The Presidio was meant to help oversee and protect the missionary effort, as well as to help protect the frontier. And this is pretty much how most missions and presidios in Texas worked. But in the case of San Saba, there were also other motivations. For example, this location, given that it's so far out from the rest of Spanish Texas, the hope was that they could stage operations to conduct forays further north and perhaps even push the frontier further north into the Northern Plains region. And there was also rumors of silver in the area. And so that also was a motivating factor, that there was a possibility that maybe they could find silver deposits like they'd found in northern Mexico. And the other motivation or goal of this fort was to help to reduce, and the mission too, was to help reduce raids in San Antonio. Interestingly, if you look back and you look at how people talk about San Saba at the Presidio, it's largely kind of seen as a failure. But the one thing it did do was it did help reduce the raids. but not for the reason you may think. It wasn't because they were great at reducing this on their own through military actions. It was just that they provided a new target. So, you know, it was just a lot easier to go raid the Presidio than to run into San Antonio and do the raiding there, because they were in Comanche and Apache country. So, unfortunately, the mission did not last long. It was there for about 13 months. And during that time, the Lipan had told the Franciscan friars that they were willing to enter the mission, but they would come after the next bison hunt. Well, they made these promises time and time again, and they never did settle. By the early months of 1758, the mission experienced pretty much the end of their existence. Some Comanches and their Norteño allies, who were angered by the alliance that the Spanish had formed with the Lipan, who were their enemies, came to the mission, and they were allowed in, and they proceeded to attack and destroy. They burned the mission down. They killed about half a dozen people, including the two priests that you see here in this painting. So this was memorializing their sacrifice. They were martyred, and I think it speaks to the significance of this event and how it was felt throughout Spanish colonial Texas and even beyond. After the attack, the mission was not rebuilt, but the Presidio remained open. It stayed open till about 1770 or so. One of the really important things to note here is that there were a lot of things that resulted after the destruction of the mission, but one of the things that we can physically see is mission architecture changed. Now, mission architecture evolves over time for sure in Texas, but what we see after the destruction of Mission San Saba are a lot of changes that come quickly. So towards the end of the 1750s and into the 1760s, the missionaries in particular, although most of Spanish Texas was horrified and very fearful of another attack like this, the missionaries were particularly concerned. And so they began to reinforce their missions. So if they didn't have a compound wall, they built one. If they had one, they reinforced it. And in some instances, they even added bastions. So they were turning their missions into defensive or fortified structures. At Presidio San Saba, in the aftermath of this, the commander who was in charge of the garrison, Colonel Perea, attempted to carry out a punitive expedition against the mission offenders, but it kind of had mixed results, and so more or less it was deemed a failure. And Felipe Rabago, who is an interesting character in Spanish Texas, I won't go into detail about him because that takes a whole nother lecture, but he was quite a nefarious character, an accused murderer, rapist, you name it, he did it. He was once, someone quoted something about him saying that he had more money than sense. And it was that money and his connections that allowed him to secure the position as commander in 1760 and replaced Perea. So when Rabago arrives at San Saba, he sees that you've got a series of wattle and daub, mud huts, and a log stockade or palisade wall around the fort, and he decides this is not enough. We need to reinforce this. So he wants to build a stone fortress, and he commences to do that, and he does it with his own money. In his mind, he's thinking that he will ask for a reimbursement later, and he forges ahead with his plan. And in 1762, his grand fortress of stone is completed. In this lower corner on the right, you'll see an artist's rendering of what that fortress looked like. Some of you may have worked at the Presidio, and it's very accurate. It's actually based on contemporary maps that were made in the 1760s and also verbal descriptions. Now, despite Rabago's character, he did do some interesting things. In interestingly enough, the Lipan petitioned Robago after he becomes commander for another mission or series of missions for them. But they're asking for a series of, they said, listen, if you build this for us, we'll come, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. So they had a list of demands. And at first, Robago balked at that. But then after thinking about some of the demands, for example, they wanted at least 2 missions. They wanted them located further south away from the Comanche, their enemies. And they wanted to have soldiers stationed at the missions. And also they wanted them to give them an escort every time they went out to hunt bison. Robago eventually acquiesced and agreed to establishing these missions, and it isn't because, at least I don't think, it was because he had a change of heart and decided he was going to be a good Catholic and become pious, but I think it was strategic. I think that he probably was concerned about his strategic location. He's 100 miles from anybody, out in the middle of nowhere. Help is not going to arrive quickly, and if the Lipan and the Comanche ever decide to form an alliance against the Spanish, they would wipe him off the map. So I think that is largely responsible for his decision to allow that. Now, the other interesting thing about these missions, or the El Cañon missions as they would be called by the Spanish, because they're located in the Canyon area in Real County around Camp Wood, is that they were both unauthorized. Robago did not get permission. I think it was like everything else he did. He figured, well, I'll just ask for forgiveness. Better that than to ask permission. So in 1762, he called on a friend of his who was a Franciscan missionary who came up and agreed to oversee the missionary operation. And 2 missions were established, San Lorenzo and Candelaria. So for those of you that were part of the 2017 and 2018 excavations, and you were familiar with Mission San Lorenzo. San Lorenzo is located in Camp Wood, and about 8 miles south in Montel is the site of Candelaria. That site is located on private property, and we have yet to gain access. So I have not seen it. I do know it's the smaller mission, and it closed earlier than Mission San Lorenzo. San Lorenzo was in operation. Officially, they said it closed in 1770, but it was pretty much defunct by 1768. So what you see here are some pictures on the right of how it looked in, I think that was 2018, a photo from the top. You can see how dry it was that year. For those of you who were there, you remember. You can kind of see how the site looks. And then down below, there is a picture before the investigations took place. And then the map shows you in that little red circular area, its relationship to Presidio San Saba. So as I said, the mission was there for about 6 years or so. And while TAS and Texas Tech conducted investigations there recently, those were not the first investigations at the site. In fact, the first archaeological investigations to take place here were completed in 1962 by Curtis Tunnell. So it was the 200-year anniversary of the founding of Mission San Lorenzo. And the community was interested in restoring the mission, hoping to rebuild it. And that's where Curtis Tunnell came in. And so one of his biggest goals was to help define the mission, the layout of the mission. What did it look like? How big was it? What kind of structures were there? What's the architecture like? There are no, at least to our knowledge, nothing has been found yet of a map that was drawn. We do have verbal descriptions in the archival records, but we really need archaeology to tell us what the site looks like. During his investigations, Tunnell was able to expose the 4 corners of the mission. You can, I'm sorry for the faint image here. This is scanned out of his report, but you can see that he was able to really define a lot of the mission. He, for example, identified the bastion, which is in the northest to the top. In the southwest corner, you have a bastion. In the southeast corner, you have number 8 is the stable. Number 2 is the church, and the series of buildings that are to the north of the church are believed to be the sacristy and the convento, or where the friars lived. And then in the northeast corner, you have the granary with a flagstone floor. Most of these structures are of adobe architecture, but for example, you've got at the bastion, you have adobe covered rock, and there are other structures that mix stone construction with adobe construction. In the northwest corner, you have a series of buildings or structures that I think some of that he got a little wrong, but he believed that there might have been a kitchen there and maybe some Indian living quarters. So what you don't see here is the architecture along the north wall. We didn't know how the corners connected, and we didn't know a lot about the western wall of the mission either. The western wall probably had the most damage to it. It had been partially bulldozed in previous years, so it wasn't in great shape. So one of the first things we were concerned about with our investigations during the 17 and 18 seasons was the exposure of mission architecture. What's left? Can we define it? And can we help fill in the gaps of the map that was made by Curtis Tunnell? In addition, we were also hoping to get a good sample from some of the features that he had identified, including some middens, and also looking for features in the compound area to give us a sense of what life was like for these folks, and also to give us a chance to investigate a mission that was unauthorized and how that may or may not look like other missions. Okay, so turning to the 2017 and 18 investigations and looking at the architecture, we were able to actually fill in a lot of those question marks when it came to the architectural layout of the site. This is a drone shot of the mission. Again, you can see some of our excavation units open. You can see the fence line. You'll notice that that fence line encloses the mission architecture, and that's all owned by the city. Beyond those fence lines, that is private property, and we did not have access to any of those spaces. So unfortunately, the areas where we think the Mission Indians probably were coming and hanging out at are not in the areas we excavated. That's not to say that they weren't there. It's just that, just like at San Saba, the Lipan came and went as they chose, and when there were bison hunts, they left. They weren't here permanently, so they were probably camping outside, using this as another resource, and coming in when there was food. And there were probably some people who stayed here, likely the infirm, maybe elderly and young folks who were here permanently. But when you consider that you had 20 Presidio soldiers and their families living here, those made up the bulk of the population. If you look at the bottom here, this is just to show you what we found. This is part of a structure that was identified along the north wall, and you can see, lucky for us, there was some intact adobe architecture. So you've got at least 2 courses of adobe block architecture here. And in this photo here, you can also see that we were able to expose the entire length of that north wall, connecting the 2 corners. I believe this is a view looking to the east. So now we have a really good idea of what that north wall looks like. In addition, we were also able to expose additional architecture along the west wall that gave us an idea of the structures and buildings that were found there. And you can see that in this sketch that combines Curtis's map and our map based on the work that we did in 2017 and 2018. You can see that there are a series of rooms, we believe, along the west wall as well as along the north wall. We were able to identify those and delineate them, and also pay attention to the 2 gaps that are along the north wall. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But one thing that's worth noting too is that Tunnell erroneously noted that the main gate was to the south of the granary in the northwest corner, or excuse me, northeast corner. We found evidence that suggested that in fact there was no gate there, but it's more likely that gate is probably along the south wall as it is depicted here. It just makes more sense that it would have been there. You've got the stables right there, the topography of the site. It's a much more gentle, it's a gentler rise to get to that gate than it would be where Curtis actually had it placed. So just a couple of things that I want to point out. But the thing that I think really stood out to me when looking at this is the defensive architectural features that were incorporated into this site. Now, obviously, there was a bastion, and that bastion was fully uncovered by Curtis Tunnell during his investigations. And it was one of the most sturdy buildings at the mission, in addition to the church and the granary. But in addition to that defensive feature, we also have some evidence for some other defensive architectural features, including what we think is a post-turn gate along the north wall. Actually, we think that the two gaps along the north wall where we didn't find evidence of another structure are both post-turn gates, but we had pretty good evidence for a post-turn gate near the northeast corner next to the granary. We know from documentary records that that granary also served as a secondary bastion. So it's opposite the corner of the formal bastion. And in that way, if they needed to defend the mission, they had all sides covered. We know that they pulled cannons on top of there, and there's also some evidence that they had built a rampart. And so that's kind of included in that bottom sketch in the lower left. So this post-turn gate would have allowed people to go out and get water from the spring that was nearby, just as the other one along the northwest corner would have allowed people to gain access to the river. But if they were attacked and somehow that gate was breached, it could be protected from the top of that granary / bastion, and that funnel area there would have slowed people down. Another interesting suggestion that I think perhaps is a good candidate for a defensive feature is the stone foundations that were uncovered in the kids units. And you can see here there's stone construction, and we thought maybe it was a 19th century structure, but the material culture speaks otherwise. And given its placement and the gap between it and the granary, I think it's a good candidate for a powder magazine. They certainly would have needed a place to store their gunpowder, and perhaps this is where it was placed. So all of these things are creating a really interesting picture and are creating what I'm calling a hybrid architectural form. Because what you have here at San Lorenzo is features of a mission and a Presidio. And while in other missions, these things are added on later and evolve over time, here it's baked into the plan. And it's all a response to and a reaction to what happened at San Saba. They don't have a Presidio nearby, and that's another unique aspect of this site. And so they have to combine the function and practicality of a Presidio with a mission. So alongside your church and your sacristy and your convento, you've got these defensive features, and it makes for a really, really unique site, and one that I think has been sorely overlooked, but also very interesting. Now, in addition to the architecture, we also obviously collect a lot of artifacts and material culture that's giving us some further insight. And we're still asking questions about this, but there's still some new data that's starting to develop, and a better picture of the mission is taking shape for us. So not surprising, a lot of the artifacts are military in nature. Gun flints, lead shot. We've got parts of guns like this top jaw part that you're seeing in the lower right. And then on the bottom middle, this is a trigger guard. Some folks have suggested it might be a French trigger guard. I don't know. But what we're seeing here is evidence of the lives and activities of Presidio soldiers. And it's very similar to what you would see at a Presidio. And keep in mind, you had at least 20 soldiers here, in addition to the soldiers that would sometimes arrive with Robigo when he retreated from San Saba and came down to San Lorenzo and holed up there for a while. In addition, you also have domestic and personal artifacts, and I just picked a few of the really interesting items, including on the top, this watch fob seal, a side view and a view of the seal itself. This would have been on a attached to a chain. Pocket watches were popular in the 18th century, and they would have had 3 chains typically. You would have, and they would hang from your pocket, and you would have your pocket watch on one chain, you would have your key to wind up the pocket watch, and then you would have a personal seal like this item here. So what it is I think it's some kind of cuprous material. It's a filigree metal, and inside of it is quartz or glass. And I'm not sure if you can see it in the picture here, but I don't know if that's Athena, or I can't remember. We had kind of gone back and forth about the bust image, that it was either Athena or some other Greek or Roman character, I don't know. But this would have been the seal, someone's personal seal, and likely belonged to a person of importance, maybe an officer or maybe one of the priests that was in charge here. In addition, this really awesome copper bowl, almost entirely complete except for a little hole in the bottom, that was recovered from one of the mission structures, giving us a sense of the kinds of items that, and the scissors that were used on a daily basis here. Ceramics were also quite interesting. And overall, the material culture here is interesting, and it's the same stuff that we see at other Spanish colonial sites, but the devil is in the details, and it's the percentage of different types of artifacts that are really informative. For example, when you compare the ceramics here to other contemporaneous missions, it doesn't look anything like them. It looks a whole lot like Presidio San Saba, which makes sense because the people that were living at San Saba were transferred here, and they brought their domestic goods here. We also know that supply was tough for these folks. This was funded by Robigo, who also thought he was going to get reimbursed for this, but the priests had to get creative when they were trying to supply this mission, because San Antonio was so disgusted by Robigo, they were not inclined to help him out. So they had to get goods elsewhere. So we're learning a lot about the supply route and what's coming in and what's not coming in just by looking at the ceramics. The same thing can really be said about the faunal remains too. The faunal remains, at least from initial reports, it seems that it looks a lot like what they're eating at San Saba, with the exception that they seem to be eating more deer and less beef. We did not find any religious artifacts during the 2017 and 2018 excavations, but Curtis Tunnell did. He found them when he was excavating the church. There were 2 smallpox epidemics at the mission, and as a result, a lot of people died, in particular, some of the neophytes and especially the children. They were buried underneath the church floor, and when Tunnell excavated those, they recovered several religious medallions and crosses and crucifixes. And that all speaks to the religious underpinnings of this site. Other clothing or personal items include a lot of clothing buttons and buckles. These button covers are a good example of the kinds of buttons that were collected, along with trade beads and even a few glass earrings that likely belonged to the wives of the Presidio soldiers. So again, this is all giving us a really good sense of what's there, what it looks like, how it compares to other sites, so on and so forth. And we're still learning. So, in kind of closing this out, and like I said, we're still finding out new things. But I had some parting thoughts that I think are worth pondering. The first thing that we can definitely say is that the unique circumstances of San Lorenzo, and what I mean by that is that San Lorenzo and Candelaria were the 2 of the last mission sites to be established in Texas. So they really represent the beginning of the end of the mission era in Texas. The only mission established after that was a refugio in 1792. And that's unique. And they're also the first missions to be established after the attack and destruction of Mission San Saba. And all of that is reflected in both the material and the architectural record. You know, the fact that it really did serve as both a presidio and a mission, that's unique for San Lorenzo. And another thing that it's important to keep in mind about not just San Lorenzo, but in particular San Saba, is that those consequences of the events that occurred there didn't just impact, you know, San Saba and Presidio San Saba and San Lorenzo. There's an argument to be made that it also reverberated beyond Spanish Texas. You often hear when you're reading about the end of the mission era in Texas about the Texas Mission Plan. I think that is the Texas Mission Plan, or the way the missions were laid out in Texas. It reaches its height with San Lorenzo, and what we see at San Lorenzo encompasses all the lessons learned in Texas. You know, if you look in the beginning, looking at those early missions, and you compare it to what we're seeing at San Lorenzo, a lot has happened. And we know that at the end of the Spanish era, or the mission era in Texas, we know that they are looking, you know, they're saying that, hey, there's not much going on here in Texas, especially after Louisiana is ceded to Spain. Texas becomes less important. The missionaries start to withdraw, and they start looking towards greener pastures, including California. And so I think there's a really good argument to be made that the Texas Mission Plan, aka San Lorenzo, that we could perhaps see aspects of that in the very earliest missions in California, because the Franciscans that went there were some of the same that were in Texas and trained in the same places. And as they left Texas, they brought those lessons with them to California. So I've talked a lot, and hopefully I haven't left too much out, but I am willing to entertain questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Walter. I'm looking for, questions in the chat. I don't see any. I'll start out with one. I was wondering, when you were talking about the earlier excavations at Mission San Lorenzo, where is that collection housed from the earlier excavations?
Tarl, but it was originally, oh gosh, and I'm going to forget, the Texas Memorial Museum. There were some records and maybe artifacts, I don't know, that were kept in the basement of the Memorial Museum, is what I've heard, and it flooded. So some of that has been lost.
And has anybody tried to work with the landowner who has the Mission Candelaria?
Say that gets yes, and they have not been open to that, unfortunately, because it would be really cool to see that mission and see how it compares to San Lorenzo.
All right. I just briefly will read that question in the chat from Becky. Besides San Lorenzo and Candelaria, were there other records of offshoot mission or presidio attempts after the fall of San Saba?
Okay, that's kind of interesting. There were the garrison at San Saba was moved. So for a while, you'll see in the records that they'll say Presidio San Saba, and I think Santa Rosa is what they became. So that it just kind of moved and was no longer in that area. But it was, I think, a lot of the same folks were there after it moved that were stationed at San Saba. But the missions, it's interesting. Robigal actually had permission to try to start new missions again. He didn't have permission to do that 100 miles away, but he did it anyway. So what are you going to do?
All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Was that Sebastian?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned I believe it was the San Saba mission,
Mhm.
that it was attacked by the Comanche and their Norteño allies. Is that what you said?
Mhm. Yes.
Who are they?
Wichita, there are other tribes in there. Chris Lentz could probably give you a list better than me. But the Wichita,
Okay. So they are Native American.
yeah.
Okay, that's why I was
Yeah.
asking, because often I've heard people say Norteño when they're talking about Mexican Americans in Northern California, and I was curious if that was the case here.
No. There were a series of groups that they had allied with. I can't give you a full list, but
Okay.
They're primarily Wichita Indians that were aligned with the Comanches during the attack. The Wichita Indians actually, from the earliest exploration, have about 13 different tribal names of various confederations that when they merged together. But we recognize them today as the Wichita and affiliated tribes. I have a question.
yes, Chris, and thank you for filling that in. So I knew you had the
Thank you.
answer.
Thank you as well.
Yes.
Sebastian, you finished? Okay, the question I have is that you indicated that you did not have access to work the private land where the indigenous campsites were, but then you also mentioned that the people at San Lorenzo were not tied into the trade relationships per se in San Antonio. What kinds of indigenous artifacts were the folks at San Lorenzo using to supplement what they could get through trade?
Well, I'm going to tell you that the differences that we're seeing is more to do with getting stuff out of the Guerrero missions, so they had to go through there. But I think the big difference you see is, I think, the fact that they're probably relying on the natives for protein. I think with deer, you see more of that. We see no indigenous pottery. I shouldn't say no. We have very little of it. I mean, maybe 5 or 6 sherds. So I think the supply, I mean, we're still figuring that out, but I don't think they're getting much from the Lipan.
Thank you.
I'm looking, somebody asked me about, I can see, I'm looking in the chat right now. The question about plans for continuing the work. The one thing I would like to do at San Lorenzo, there's 2 things, a couple of things actually. At San Lorenzo, I would like to confirm where that gate is so we can, okay, we know where that is. That's a small thing that we could do. At San Saba, there's a corner of the fort we have not been able to fully document the architecture there, and that's something there. And then recently, a couple of things have happened at San Saba. The property next to the Presidio, it's privately owned. We just recently excavated, just this summer, we excavated a huge lime kiln. I mean, it's huge. It's 3 meters wide, over 3 meters deep. And so we're going to continue to work on that. And there's a well there at San Saba that may be something we look into later. So that's kind of the work that could happen in the future. And Sonny, the crucifixes have not been returned. That's a good question. You ask if the crucifixes have been returned to the burials. The human remains are still at Tarl. So, and so are the burial goods. Yeah.
All right, and Dr. Walter, you see a question about the lime kiln?
Yeah, I saw that. I'm not sure what they I'm not sure what they want to know about the lime kiln. The lime kiln, if you don't know what it is, it would have been used for the stone construction, right? They needed lime to make mortar, And it's very, very similar. The lime kiln is very similar to the ones we see in San Antonio at the San Antonio missions. So that's really exciting too. That is, and it's actually intact. I mean, it's great. So that was a lot of fun to get to look at that too this summer. Steve Lowe. Okay. The landowners providing, okay. Steve Lowe wants to know if there's any possibility of the landowners providing access to the site of the Campwood military camp. You would know better than me. I have not heard, from the community about that. My hope is that when the lady, I know she's elderly, and if she passes away, well, she will pass away, as we all will. But when she dies, the hope is that the heirs will put the property up for sale, and that we might have an opportunity to purchase it. So I know that's what they're kind of looking at, but as of now, we do not have permission to look at that site. Okay, Sebastian, you mentioned, okay, I'm reading Sebastian's question. He's asking about the mission being unauthorized. The authorizing authority for a mission would have been the crown, the viceroy. They would have had to ask the government for permission, because that's where the funding comes from. And in conjunction with, in theory, they would need to also talk to the church authorities. He did neither. I think he just kind of went around and did it on his own. By the way, he never got his money back. He died en route trying to get it, though. Okay, Gus is asking, is anyone doing anything or hoping to do anything new at El Orcoquisac in the Houston area? I don't know. Someone else can answer that, maybe.
All right. There's another one. Another question in the chat.
Okay. Oh, Katrina, that's a really good question. Here's kind of exciting thing that I'm just making me crazy about this site. Okay, so it's a little bit complicated. All right, there were, I don't know, 40 or 50 burials, I think, in the church. I'm not sure. And I think that Tarl has maybe 18 of them. But there exists a burial book that was kept of the people who passed away during the time that the mission was in use and were buried in the church. I know the first entry and the last entry for those burials because it was listed in another inventory for Mission San Bernardo. Because they did an inventory at San Bernardo and they found this book, which was a book of the marriages, baptisms, and burials at San Lorenzo. And so they said, oh, we found this book and here's the first entry for the baptisms and the last. And they did that for marriages, deaths, and baptisms. And I can't find it. So it would be really cool if we could try to match up, because these people have names and we know their sex, we know their names, and we also know their ethnic affiliation. So to be able to look at those before they are reinterred, which we would like to do. We've consulted with the Mescalero and who are the federally recognized tribe that represent for the Lipan. We've talked to them about that possibility, but I would really like to find those documents because then we could compare them to the human remains that are at Tarl and maybe say, hey, we know who this is. So I think that would be a first in Texas. Okay. Sebastian's asking if it's common for the families of soldiers to travel with them. By this time, yes. That was not uncommon for soldiers to have their wives and families with them on the frontier. In earlier times, not so much. But yeah, by this time, definitely, we see that a lot.
All right. Well, any questions from the floor?
if I could add a comment briefly, the lime kilns, of course, are very common on military forts across Texas, 19th century military forts. And there, when I was working at the Archaeomagnetic Dating Lab back in the mid 1970s at the University of Oklahoma, there was a fellow there that earned his PhD in history, dating the lime kilns by the orientation of the baked clay in the walls of those.
Mhm.
That fellow is I think a teacher at Frisco, Texas. His name is Dwayne Hale. I don't know if you're aware of it or
Oh, yeah, I've heard of Dwayne Hill. Yes,
just wanted to share that bit of information.
No, that's good. Well, I mean, I'm just so excited that the thing is intact. It's just incredible. Just amazing. So we didn't get the firebox, but we got the funnel on top exposed. So, you know, that's pretty cool.
Very cool. All right. Well, any further questions in chat or from the floor for Dr. Walter? Okay. Well, Dr. Walter, I want to thank you very much. Many thanks for the terrific presentation and for fielding all the questions and comments from everybody. We really appreciate
well, yeah, well, thank you for having me. I always, like I said, I could go on and on about this, but I won't. But I appreciate the opportunity. It's so good to see everybody, and glad to know that you're going to be meeting in person soon.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well,
right.
everybody, y'all have a great night out there. Thank you, Dr. Walter. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Thanks, everybody. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Have a good weekend.
You too.